Okay. Now we're recording, so we'll be able to record this program for those of you who'd like to see it again, or maybe weren't able to be with us, and you can tell some friends about it. Anyway, okay. Dr. Peggy Macdonald is a public historian and adjunct professor at Stetson University and also Indian River College. She received her PhD in American history from the University of Florida, and she's a native Floridian, and she lives in Gainesville. Dr. Macdonald gives presentations on a variety of topics in Florida history with Florida Humanities, having to do with Florida Humanities. She has written about local and Florida history for Forum Magazine, Gainesville, the Gainesville Magazine, Our Town Magazine, and Senior Times. Dr. Macdonald's first book, which was expanded from her dissertation, her PhD dissertation, was on Marjorie Harris Carr, Defender of the Florida's Environment. This was a great book, really readable. It came out in 2014, and many of you will recall seeing her when she spoke here on the book back in 2015. Dr. Macdonald is currently working on a book now about Florida female pioneers, and she served as executive director for about 4 years at the Matheson Museum in Gainesville. And tonight, Dr. Macdonald, though, will join us, and she'll talk about her research on Florida women's fight for suffrage. And Peggy, we're really delighted to have you with us.
Thank you. It's so exciting to return. And even though we're in our new normal with Zoom, it's such a nice way to connect with people, especially history buffs. Yeah, that day that I spoke about the Carr book for the Florida Lecture Series, it was November 2014. And I actually drove up to Gainesville in the morning, interviewed for the executive director position at the Matheson, drove back and gave the talk. It was an exciting day. So thank you for inviting me back. So for tonight, we're going to be talking about something that fits with the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So before we get into the details related to Florida women's fight for suffrage, I want to provide a bit of an overview of what conditions were like for American women going into that battle, right? What inspired that battle? So for Florida women and for women across the nation, even before the American Revolution, but also continuing well into the 20th century, the principles of coverture were still in play in America. So inherited from British common law and also practiced across Europe. Under coverture, when the woman and the man married, they were one, and the husband was the one. A woman, upon entering into marriage, lost her legal identity. She lost her rights to own property. All of her property became her husband's, just like Martha Custis' property became George Washington's property, and that's when he really became a wealthy owner of humans, right, through his wife's property. And women even lost control over their children. So later, when women were working in the suffrage movement, especially in England, where it got violent, that type of activity could lead to women losing their children, right? The father, the husband, had control. So this is part of what was going on, what women were rebelling against. And a really good example of this is Abigail Adams. And she's unique in that we have her letters. She wrote extensively. She wrote in her letters to her husband, John Adams, that he didn't reply enough or write enough as she did. And in a March 1776 letter, famous letter where we see what women were thinking during the American Revolution, especially elite white women, she said, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion. and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. So kudos to Abigail Adams for expressing this sense where women wanted to be included in the new revolutionary discussion of rights and citizenship. And another woman who is best known, and this is after Abigail Adams, right? She was writing in 1776. In 1792, we have the most popular work by Mary Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And this is really the English inspiration for American suffragists. This is the first proto-feminist philosophy where she is commenting on what European and American writers have been writing about, right, since the Enlightenment, which is natural rights, the concept of natural rights. And she argues that it needs to be extended to women. Women need to receive equal education and rights so that they will be good wives and mothers and raise good citizens. This is a precursor to, in American history, what later became known as Republican motherhood, right? The argument that because they are mothers and they raise young male citizens, they deserve education. In fact, Susan B. Anthony had a framed portrait of Wollstonecraft hanging in her home. Now, people often talk about the Seneca Falls Convention as being really the kickstart for the American feminist movement, or they wouldn't have used that term at the time, but actually it was 1840 in London at the World Anti-Slavery Convention that women from America were distressed that they were not seated. American and British participants in the conference excluded American women who had traveled. And these women were abolitionists, every bit as fervent in working to end slavery as their male counterparts. You could see this detail at the bottom right, and it's located here in the portrait, this woman with a fascinating hat, right? The women, much like Shirley Chisholm, centuries later advised, if you're not offered a seat at the table, pull up a chair. Well, they couldn't pull up a chair, but they stood in the margins, and you can see it captured in this painting. So this inspired American women to fight not only for an end to slavery, but also for their own rights. And in particular, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott were there in 1840 and were not seated. And this ultimately led to the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, most people associate this convention with the push for an amendment to the Constitution to allow women to vote. And that is a big outcome, but the Declaration of Sentiments, which was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, was actually really pushing back against coverture. So the push for the suffrage was one important part of the Declaration of Sentiments, the outcome of this convention. But overall, women were pushing for equality, equal access to education. They wanted rights to, legal rights to be restored, rights to property, and essentially what Wollstonecraft had argued for in 1792, natural rights, education, and citizenship. Now, Sojourner Truth is an example of a split in the women's suffrage movement. Sojourner Truth, who rejected the name that the man who, quote, owned her, gave her, Isabella Baumfree, and chose the name Sojourner Truth, championed the idea that women were among the enslaved and women were among those who deserved equality and suffrage. So she argued, and when she would speak, right, she would speak across the nation. And when she spoke, she was every bit as tall and commanding as Frederick Douglass. They were both 6 feet tall. And she argued that women were among the enslaved. And usually people viewed slavery as a masculine institution. But when white men argued that women were frail and needed special protections, her "Ain't I a Woman" speech was about her own experiences, right? Where she had worked hard, had been owned by 4 different men, and had suffered the brutality of slavery. And yet she argued that she deserved that same recognition as men. Meanwhile, fast forwarding in time to the end of the Civil War and the beginning of Reconstruction, at the same time that you have Congress pushing forth the 14th and 15th constitutional amendments to allow formerly enslaved Black men the rights of citizenship and the suffrage, in the territory of Wyoming, where they were trying radical, different things, there was a push to allow white women, right, to allow women to vote. Part of the idea was that if Chinese workers in the Wyoming territory and Black workers would be able to vote, and presumably they would vote Republican, that white women should also be extended the suffrage, and that, again, presumably, they would vote for the party that had given them the vote, the Democrats. So by 1870 in Wyoming, you have women voting. This is the first time in world history that women had the right to vote. However, they didn't vote the way the Democrats hoped. They were voting for Republicans. They elected some Republicans. So there were Democrats in the Wyoming territory legislature that tried to repeal women's suffrage, but the Republican governor vetoed this effort, and women continued to be able to vote 50 years before the 19th Amendment would be ratified. Now let's jump back to Florida. What's going on in Florida at the time that you have out west, the first territories, right, offering the women the right to vote for the first time in world history? Florida, of course, is its own beast, right? So Florida goes from being the first colony in the New World, so to speak, right, in the present day United States, a Spanish colony that is then overlooked in our history, to, at the time of the suffrage movement, a new territory in the new state that is very sparsely populated by whites and by women. And so it is rural, it is not a hotbed of suffrage activism at the time of the Seneca Falls Convention. However, it will come to play a role, as would other states and territories across the nation. And most historians of Florida's suffrage movement point to Ella Chamberlain as the originator, right? She moved to Florida in 1892. She was writing a column for the Tampa Morning Tribune. Her editor wanted her to write about traditional women's and children issues, but she said there were enough cake recipes that had been put into newspapers, and she wanted to write about something more exciting, women's rights. So through the power of the pen, she started to advocate for suffrage. And then she wound up leading to the Florida Women's Suffrage Association, and it was established and it was affiliated with the National Women's Suffrage Association. However, her approach to the suffrage argument was that as a white woman, she should be able to vote if, quote, the Negro and the alien were voting, right? So it was anti-immigrant, anti-Black approach to suffrage. Didn't go over very well in the Tampa area with the cigar industry and so many immigrants working there. Plus, she and her husband had orange groves, and shortly after the great freezes of 1894 to 1895, they left the state. And traditionally, historians say that the suffrage movement floundered in Florida at that point. But there really wasn't one unified suffrage movement. Ida B. Wells, although she's not a Florida woman per se, was an example of this, right? So she's starting to get more attention now that we have the anniversary, because in 1913, at an important suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., the National Women's Suffrage Association decided that Black women could not march in the parade with their white fellow activists. They would have to march at the back of the parade. Ida B. Wells was crushed. She couldn't believe this. So she waited in the crowd, and when her state walked by with the white women, she went out and marched with them rather than doing it at the back. And this is yet another example of this divide in the movement, right? So the National Women's Suffrage Movement, in theory, allowed Black women to be members, but enforced this segregated policy when it came to public marches. At the state level and at the local level, Black women were not welcome. They were not welcome in Florida women's clubs or equal suffrage or women's suffrage associations. So we'll find that they formed their own. This picture shows Eartha White in the center at the bottom, and she is especially well known in Jacksonville for her many contributions, her many philanthropic organizations she established in her work, and also how through establishing a nursing home, for instance, for African Americans, she became the greatest employer of African Americans. But in 1920, her most important work was in galvanizing thousands of Black men and women, right? So even though in theory, Black men in Florida had the right to vote, according to the 15th Amendment, for 50 years, in practice, white supremacy, grandfather clauses, poll taxes, and literacy tests prevented that. So Eartha White and other activists succeeded in registering thousands of Black male and female voters in Jacksonville and encouraging them to go to the polls to cast their vote. Getting back to the rebirth of the movement, that picture was from 1915, and we were talking about 1920 and Eartha White, once the 19th Amendment was ratified, and how she galvanized Black voters to register and to go to the polls to vote. Here in this picture with the 1892 Orange County Courthouse in the background, this photo is from the Orange County Regional History Center. We could see a suffrage float. Now, what we don't know is whether this was part of a larger suffrage parade or one suffrage float in part of a different parade. But in this image, you could see on the banner, it says equal suffrage. So originally under Ella Chamberlain with her anti-Black, anti-immigrant message, the women's suffrage movement in Florida was affiliated with the National Women's Suffrage Association. In its rebirth in the 19-teens, it was affiliated with the National Equal Suffrage Association. So different name, same cause. And what happened was in 1912, the Orlando mayor called upon all freeholders to register to vote in Orlando. A group of women tried to register to vote, and the various city clerks didn't know what to do. The city attorney then clarified to them that women do not have the right to vote according to the Florida Constitution. So to these women, it felt like a clear example of taxation without representation. And the Orlando Equal Suffrage League became one of the most active suffrage groups in the state. This picture is from the next year, 1913. Mary Stafford is another woman. She was the president of the Orlando Equal Suffrage League, became president of the Florida Equal Suffrage League. She was a strong woman against her family's wishes. She had served as a minister. Even today, women ministers are still considered controversial in many different sects. So she lobbied the Congress to pass the 19th Amendment to allow women to vote, right? This was one of the major goals of Florida suffragists. There were different tactics. Pushing for a federal amendment to the Constitution to allow women to vote was one tactic. Another tactic that Florida women took was to petition and lobby the Florida legislature to amend the Florida Constitution to allow women to vote. Yet another strategy was to allow women to vote in primaries. And this was more of a pleasant, appealing option for white men who did not want millions of Black women to gain the right to vote. The idea was that if women could only vote in primaries, on the one hand, women gained suffrage. On the other hand, that Blacks could be excluded because the only primaries in Florida at the time were Democratic primaries. In comes Mayman Jennings. Mayman Jennings is in this picture known for being First Lady of Florida when her husband, William Sherman Jennings, was governor from 1901 to 1905. She's not famous, though, for being a First Lady. She's known for her work to establish different organizations from the first Florida Board of Forestry to working for the establishment of libraries. But as president of the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs from 1914 to 1917, Jennings played a pivotal role in convincing the Florida Federation, which was the largest group of women organized group of women in the state. There were over 10,000 members. She convinced them to support suffrage at a time when the state leaders were wary of doing so. The view was that suffrage was a political issue, and because it was political, it could jeopardize the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs' other work, right? They were establishing the first public libraries in communities across the state. They were working on projects with the Seminole projects to extend the school year so that school children could attend school for more than a few months per year. They were doing so much good work. And the view was that embracing suffrage would damage that work. Well, Jennings countered that view. She convinced the Federation's leadership to embrace suffrage. And by 1915, the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs was lobbying the Florida legislature to amend the state constitution to allow women to vote. So Jennings deserves a great deal of the credit for moving the movement forward, even though this was operating within segregated women's clubs. In Gainesville, Caroline Palmer was president of the Gainesville Women's Club, which was known as the 20th Century Club, and then became president of the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs after Jennings. So she carried on the Federation's battle, lobbying the Florida legislature. They also issued telegrams and condemned and censured the US senators who did not support the 19th Amendment, and they criticized them for not being in keeping with the progressive spirit of the times. Interestingly, in Gainesville, the Women's Club Board of Directors recently attempted to sell the clubhouse that the 20th Century Club had worked so hard to build, but the Florida Federation has come through and has urged the club members to come together and to work together on another solution. So the pandemic has been hard for women's clubs and other nonprofits, because in the case of the Women's Club, renting out the big building is a big fundraiser, and that hasn't happened during the pandemic. Stepping back to the story, before the 19th Amendment was ratified in Florida, voting was already taking place for the women who lived in Fellsmere. This is Xena Dreyer, and she is the first woman to vote in Florida. She voted in a municipal election. So even before women gained the right to vote at the federal level, they were voting in different communities in municipal elections. So I've already discussed the suffrage strategies, but isn't that a lovely map of Florida? Let's move on to the most radical activist for suffrage in Florida. And this was Mary Nolan. Now, Judith Poucher has written about her activism. There's an article in the Florida Historical Quarterly. And Mary Nolan was in her 70s, and she went to Washington, D.C. multiple times, was arrested multiple times, referred to her imprisonment as the Night of Terror, where, again, as a woman in her 70s, she was shoved against the iron rail of the bed. She already had some issues with walking. It didn't stop her. She kept going to DC. She kept getting arrested. One time she got arrested for burning one of Woodrow Wilson's speeches outside the White House. So if you'd like to know more about Mary Nolan, I encourage you to look at Judith Poucher's article, but she's the only Florida suffragist who published a chronicle of her experience being arrested, right, as a suffragist. And it was actually published in Susan B. Anthony's newspaper. Also worthy of noting, Tampa was the site of the very first state convention for suffrage in 1895. So the Tampa Equal Suffrage League was also active when the suffrage movement was renewed in the 1910s. So Tampa, an important site. Even today, we have both presidential candidates in Tampa campaigning. So Tampa has long been a site of activism. Now, this beautiful woman who unfortunately is wearing parts of or a whole bird on her head, which she should have known better, because women were active in Audubon societies and raising awareness against wearing birds on their head. This was the first female mayor, Marion Horwitz of Moore Haven, elected, you see, in 1917. So before the 19th Amendment went into effect, 3 years before. Pearl Groves Maddox is a name that I had to do a lot of research to find. Many of these women who were suffragists and who were early politicians went by their husbands' names. So her name was listed in a Gainesville Daily Sun article from 1919, when she was the first woman elected to the Archer City Council as Mrs. H. Maddox. I did some research, found that she was actually the second Mrs. H. Maddox, found that she was a published author in a 1917 UF newspaper, The Alligator, review of her book, The Precipice. She wrote a novel. So her name was restored, Pearl Groves Maddox. So these are these early successes at clearly municipal voting, right? Women were voting in local elections, and when there were women candidates running, women voted for them and voted them into office. Another example in St. Petersburg is Virginia Burnside. Her home is currently needs to be preserved. There's a preservation movement. Preserve the Burg is working to save her home, but she was elected in July 1920. So again, a month before the 19th Amendment was ratified. This is a picture of Faye Gibson Moulton Bridges, who was the first woman in Florida to vote after the 19th Amendment was ratified. So we already know that women were voting in Florida in municipal elections, but in terms of the first federal election, the first woman to vote in Florida was Faye Gibson Moulton Bridges. She went to work at a shop. She was able to vote by outdoors. It was a very simple affair. But when she was invited to to meet the governor and also invited to the White House as being among the very first women to vote after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, she wasn't able to. She was widowed at the time, had 6 children, and couldn't attend the festivities. I want to throw into the mix Betty Mae Tiger Jumper. So part of the issue with discussing women's suffrage is it doesn't stop neatly at 1920 when the 19th Amendment is ratified. Betty Mae Tiger Jumper is noteworthy because she was the first elected female tribal chair of the Florida Seminoles and the only one so far, and the first elected female tribal chair of any American Indian nation in the United States. So while women were being elected to office for the first time across the state, I think it's worth mentioning the first Seminole woman to be elected tribal chair. This is Mayman Jennings later in life. After the 19th Amendment went into effect, she founded the League of Women Voters of Florida. And the point was to galvanize this new voting base to vote for what were considered to be, according to the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs in particular, and the General Federation of Women's Clubs, which she served as vice president of, progressive issues of the time. However, while there were white women who embraced progressivism in the early 20th century, they often espoused racism at the same time. So I've referred to the split between the white women's clubs movement, the white suffrage clubs movement, and the Black one. Dr. Marion McLeod Bethune couldn't participate in the local and state women's clubs or suffrage clubs in Florida because she was Black. So she founded the Florida Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, among other organizations. And just like Eartha White worked in Jacksonville to galvanize Black voters, men and women, to vote starting in 1920, Bethune used her school, the school that later became known as Bethune-Cookman University, to offer night classes to teach Black men and women how to read so they could pass the literacy test. She also rode on her bicycle and went door to door to collect money for a poll tax fund to help Black men and women vote. So for Bethune, education and voting were key to moving forward. At the same time, however, as the 19th Amendment is ratified, it's important to note it did not go into effect, or rather it went into effect because it's a federal amendment, but Florida did not ratify the amendment until 1969, symbolically. There were forces at work in Florida and across the nation that were actively suppressing other groups' right to vote. So just as women gained the right to vote, Women who were married to foreign nationals could not vote. In Florida, the Ocoee Massacre is now also in its 100th anniversary. And this was where, because you had African Americans attempting to use their constitutionally protected right to vote, the town was burned and there were lynchings. And for generations, African Americans did not live in Ocoee. So it's just one more example of this divide, right, between advances for white women voters and then steps back for Black male and female voters. Harry and Harriet T. Moore are another example, right? So often Medgar Evers is considered the first martyr of the civil rights movement, but the Moores lost their lives because they were registering African Americans to vote. They were both teachers, and Harry T. Moore, through his involvement with the NAACP, led a successful campaign to register over 116,000 African American voters. And so they paid the price with their lives. And I'd like to close here because we like to think often in American history and in history in general that we're constantly moving forward, but it's important to note that even as the 19th Amendment went into effect across the nation in 1920, in reality, not until 1965, the Voting Rights Act, did Black men and women really have federal protections for their right to vote. And even today, we have seen in the headlines continuing battles in Florida and across the nation, right? Designed to prevent certain groups from voting, including in Florida, former felons. So the fight for suffrage continues. I'm very grateful for you listening. I'd like to open this up to questions.
Peggy, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for that great presentation. I just had a couple of comments and a couple of questions. First off, thank you so much for sharing all of these, these interesting stories and so forth with us. What would you say? Who would you say would be the one woman? All of these women, do you think its impact on promoting women's suffrage?
It's hard to pick
Just
just
kind of
one.
an unfair question.
It's hard to pick just one because there really wasn't a unified movement. But I would definitely point out Mayman Jennings, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, and Mary Stafford, right? It's so hard to limit it to one.
Right,
it was
right.
Groups of women who are working together. And at the national level, even, right, Sojourner Truth is only just starting to get recognition, just like Ida B. Wells for her suffrage work, and the fact that Frederick Douglass was also promoting both the African American suffrage and women's suffrage. And we're in the 20th century, we're really just starting to look at these issues, right? And it's kind of, we get trapped maybe in this looking at anniversaries and deciding that an anniversary is a time to study history, but this needs to be an ongoing investigation.
The other thing that you bring out is correctly the problem of regard to the Emancipation Amendment and the friction between white women and African Americans, and of course, and these ugly sentiments, of course, can, as you show, all the way into the 20th century. There's a big call, for example, I've read about, we are looking at statues, for example, and years ago there was I think it was at Oberlin College, there was an attempt to remove Elizabeth Cady Stanton's statue because someone had discovered some negative things that she'd said about allowing women and African men to vote and not women, that kind of thing. So this is a constant theme.
That is one of the things that led to the initial split, right? That you had these white women like Stanton and Anthony who had been working first for African American an end to slavery, right? So not just suffrage, but an end to slavery, and who they really felt it was a slap in the face when Black men got the right to vote before women. So that's part of the thing that led to the split. And Frederick Douglass was essentially uninvited, or we might say nowadays unfriended, right, by some of these prominent white women activists. But it wasn't just the national level. When you look at Florida, for instance, it's this ingrained part of our culture that is a history that is, again, still not often looked at, right? This tension between what at the time, right? If you're looking at the beginning of the Civil War in Florida, Florida was essentially half Black, half white, half free and half enslaved. And so after the end of the Civil War, those tensions didn't go away. The women's suffrage movement and tensions within it are just one of the outcomes.
Now, I have one more question. Would you say that Florida, because after the Civil War, Florida received a lot of northern immigration from Northerners? And you think about Miami, of course, after the so forth, and also Tampa. Do you think Florida was any more progressive per se for southern states, or was it pretty much a wash?
That's a really good question.
Supporting that.
I mean, first thing I think of when I think of Miami in the 19th century in terms of progressivism is the idea that the Everglades is a wasteland and it should be drained, right? So
right.
William Sherman Jennings, former governor.
Right. The husband of Mayman Jennings, right.
He pushed hard for Everglades drainage. And at the same time, Mayman Jennings pushed back by establishing, working with other women from the Florida Federation to establish the first state park, Royal Palm Park, that became the nucleus of the Everglades National Park. But I asked my students in my public history class to look at their hometowns in Florida, or to look at DeLand, where Stetson is, and find examples of this lingering legacy of the Confederacy, right? Whether it's in school names or street names. And I was really impressed with what the students did. But one student mentioned that in Miami, he really couldn't find those examples of Confederate names. Now, I have not done an exhaustive study, so I cannot say it. It's completely anecdotal, but in every other town, right, where students were talking about, there were multiple examples of schools named for Confederate officers, or one student said we need to rename the Dixie Highway and name it for Dreyer, right? The first woman to vote at Fellsmere, the Dreyer Highway. And I thought that is, it's exciting to see what students come up with.
Okay, we have some, anybody would like to come in and ask a question?
Well, I would, and I'm hoping I'm unmuted. This is Mike. This is Nancy Almond, one of your has-been Florida Southern deans.
Our former dean, Nancy Almond. How are you doing?
I am doing very, very well. And
Wonderful.
Peggy, I was very interested because I live in the Rochester, New York area, and I am a certified docent at the Susan B. Anthony Museum and House. And so it's been incredible. I know New York allowed women the right to vote as early as 2 years before the amendment. And of course, this year is not only the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, but it's Susan B. Anthony's 200th birthday. And so that's very exciting.
You docents have been busy. You've been quite rebellious, haven't you? You made headlines with refusing the pardon.
Oh, exactly. That's true. And of course, as you know, the fix was in after she voted in 1872, because the trial was not scheduled for Rochester, Monroe County, where the Anthonys had incredible status, but no, Canandaigua, Ontario County. And the Associate Justice from the Supreme Court had all the paperwork done proclaiming Susan B. Anthony guilty of illegal voting. He did not allow her lawyer or her to speak, and the jury never deliberated. At one point, the presiding judge from the Supreme Court looked at the jury and said, "Thank you for your service. It is obvious Miss Anthony is guilty. She will therefore pay $100 fine," which of course she did not. But incredible history. And I would encourage anyone listening, not only is Rochester the site of the Susan B. Anthony Museum and House, but in nearby Seneca Falls, under the United States Park Service, is the area where the 1848 Rights Convention convened, and we've now purchased Elizabeth Cady Stanton's house in Seneca Falls. So very exciting. But I really want to, Mike, I want to thank you for doing this, and Peggy, this was a great presentation.
Thank
So
you,
it
Bob. You've
sounds
kind
like-
of you've
so it
done the
sounds like-
opposite. Everyone goes New York to Florida. You went Florida to New York.
That's right.
It sounds like, Dr. Almond, you've given up German history and now you're doing American history. Okay.
You know, I am, because my embarrassment is, because my PhD is in European history, specifically Central European. And as an American, I'm embarrassed how much American history I don't know. So that's been one of my retirement goals. And in fact, when I did retire, I decided that I should be learning something new every day. And considering how much I don't know, real easy goal to achieve.
That's wonderful.
Okay, are there any other questions out there for people? What we usually do with our Florida Lecture Series programs is we start at 7 and fill up the hour with questions. So we've still got another 15 minutes or so if there's any questions out there. Again, unmute yourself, I guess. I think you can probably unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like.
I do have a question. So thanks very much, Dr. Macdonald, for the great presentation. For some reason right now, I'm feeling a little cynical about voting rights in America. And I was wondering, really, I really want to try to understand this. So I had never before heard that Wyoming was the first site of legal women's suffrage. And then very quickly, you went through some of the political calculations involved in that decision. So my question is, obviously credit to the women who pushed for women's suffrage and fairness and the realization of American values, not to take anything away from them. But to what degree across the country, as suffrage became, the new normal, to what degree were women's votes just leveraged for cynical party political / racist objectives?
That's a really good question. And that describes Wyoming. At the time, the Wyoming Territory was, there were 6 men for every woman. And that statistic included African-American men and Chinese men, but not Native Americans who were not counted. And so one view was that the suffrage would bring more women. When women found out they could move to Wyoming and vote, that they would go there. That was one idea. Some people said, hey, it was all just a joke that got taken, out of control, right? It was never meant to be taken seriously. Others, there were Democrats in the legislature who thought that if they could get women's suffrage to become a reality, it would make the Republican governor look like a fool. So there were all these different reasons. There are all these different calculations, but ultimately what the Democrats liked was this is at the height of Reconstruction, right? Where African-Americans are for the first time about to be able to vote in the United States. And the view was that if women, and we're talking, the women who they envisioned voting were white women, that if they could vote, they were going to vote Democrat and it would help counter the Black vote. That was the view. So your cynicism is accurate. But that's really a strong example, but just like Dr. Almond was talking about women voting in New York, in New Jersey around the time of the revolution and shortly thereafter, there was a time where women were voting, but then that right was taken away, right? So this is sort of where, if you think of these different arguments, you have Abigail Adams saying, include us. You have years later, Mary Wollstonecraft saying, include us, right? There's this spirit of revolution and this thought grounded in the Enlightenment and the idea of natural rights, and women are speaking up saying, include us. But there are little experiments when they're included, like in New Jersey, but by and large, they're not taken seriously, right? So the reaction, John Adams' response to Abigail Adams' letter, where she says, remember the ladies, or will foment a revolution of our own, his response was that she was so funny that you might as well say that Indians and Negroes should have the right to vote. So he laughed it off, right? And he was, allegedly her loving husband.
And if I recall my reading and studies on this subject, at the time, which was becoming a bigger issue at the turn of the century, Teddy Roosevelt, who was president, and then Woodrow Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt thought it was a non-issue, really. He thought that women would just vote like their husbands and it wouldn't really matter, it wouldn't really make any difference. Could you respond to that?
I think we're coming back to a time where we're hearing that argument about women voting as their husbands would. So it is interesting.
In other words, it was a class thing. Upper people would vote the same way, lower class people would vote the same way, and it would just be a wash in terms of difference. Of course, that was, I guess, part of the speculation.
And there were women who argued that women should not have the right to vote, right?
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
And that's part of that special protections argument, right? Women have special differences, special needs, and they are frail, and that is more of the male public thing to do. It gets into the separate spheres, right? And the feminine sphere is at home and in volunteering, motherhood, and the male sphere is out in the public, including where you would vote. And voting was rather, in the 19th century anyway, it was still rather crude, right? A crude public event with alcohol and not ladylike.
Now, walk us through, we have a little bit of time, walk us through the actual final ratification. Tennessee turns out to be is the last state that was needed for the 3/4 vote. There was a lot of drama there, right? Walk us through that a little bit.
Well, it's a sad moment for Florida because when before the pandemic, when I could still go to the public library and look at the old Gainesville Daily Suns on microfilm, there was a headline, and news traveled more slowly then. So you have the passage in 1919, right, of the 19th Amendment, and within 2 days, the Gainesville Daily Sun has as a headline that Florida could be the first to ratify, and there was genuine optimism that Florida could be the first state to ratify the Constitution, this new constitutional amendment, which they were calling the Susan B. Anthony Amendment at the time. And of course, it didn't happen until 1969. And that was the same case with other, mostly Southern states. In some cases, it pushed into the early 1970s. And it really gets back to that issue of race, right? So in terms of the Florida legislature, they did not condone suffrage. There were competing views. There were some who supported. But for instance, in Gainesville, one of the legislators at one point, one of the representatives was Christopher Matheson, which you've been in his home, right? The Matheson House.
I sure have.
1967 House. And he argued that, the argument was made that out west women are voting. And he countered that the laws of the Western states and territories are no better than our own. So there was just not really so much resistance in the Florida legislature to the idea of either a state amendment to allow women the right to vote or a national amendment, except there was support for municipal voting. So that's why we have these early successes like Fellsmere in 1915, or these women who were elected to the mayoral or city commission positions starting in 1917, because the legislature did allow municipal suffrage to an increasing extent.
Well, two comments. One is Fellsmere is famous for the Bullfrog Festival, of course, in Fellsmere, Florida, near I think it is over there. And also, Florida also holds distinction for pretty much blocking the ERA amendment, of course that's an issue for another time, another talk. But Florida is very instrumental in blocking or making sure that the ERA amendment of the 1970s did not pass. They had a very strict, a very strong, strident, statesman-like legislator who named MC Barron, who blocked that. It was a real national, it had tremendous national ramifications.
If you'd like to hear more of that subject, I would put a pitch for Dr. Kimberly Wilmot Voss, and I bet she would enjoy doing a Zoom presentation. She teaches at UCF, and I think she's published 2 articles in the Florida Historical Quarterly on the ERA, but she's a really good speaker. We often speak on panels together at the Florida Conference of Historians and Florida Historical Society. But we were just on a Florida Historical Society virtual panel on the suffrage centennial, and her expertise on the issue is the ERA. So I would highly recommend her as a speaker. Yeah. It's Kimberly Wilmot Voss.
Yeah, I know Kimberly. Yeah, good. All right. Any other questions? Anybody like to ask a question?
Well, I would just interject. This is Nancy Almond again. As far as giving my tours as a Susan B. Anthony House docent, what I love about it at the very end of the tour, of course, the country was hopelessly deadlocked, as many state legislatures for the amendment as against. And at the end of the assembly session in Tennessee,
yes,
also deadlocked, a young man went home, wonderful, received a telegram from his mother. Mm-hmm. And the telegram read, "Son, do the right thing." Yes. He returned to the assembly the next day, voted for the amendment, broke the gridlock around the country. And when I give my tours, I always look at the under 12-year-old crowd and indicate, always listen to your mother.
Yeah. I want to go on one of your tours. They sound fascinating.
Yeah.
I have a lot of fun, and I love the interaction, because these tours are simply teaching in a different way. Great fun.
I like how you put that. Teaching a different way.
Well, and we and especially now with this 100th anniversary of the amendment and the 200th anniversary of Susan B. Anthony's birth, we look at up to 15,000 visitors a year and dozens from foreign countries.
Wow, that's incredible. I have experience giving tours of historic houses. Those numbers are really impressive.
Well, Peggy, I really appreciate you being with us tonight. And again, this is kind of an experiment. And I want to tell everybody that we're hoping to do something similar, not exactly the same, but something similar November 12th. So watch your emails, and we'll be joining you again that direction again, hopefully. And before long, hopefully we'll be able to have some real programs like before, but we don't know when that's going to be. So thank you everybody for being with us, and I really appreciate Peggy, and I appreciate everybody else being with us. So thank you very much for your involvement.
And thank you, Mike and Peggy. Great program.
Yes.
Thanks all of you for joining us.
Okay. Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.